A question I'm often asked is, how do I make my sourdough bread less sour? Luckily, the secret to sourdough flavor isn't really a secret at all. With just a few changes to your recipe or your process, you can change the flavor of your sourdough so that way it matches the flavor profile that you like, or it can create a family-friendly bread if you have picky eaters who don't like sour sourdough. Now, the tips that I have to offer today are not exhaustive. There are a lot of ways to change the flavor of your sourdough, but the ones I'm going to share with you today are the most foolproof and the easiest to control in your own home kitchen. So these are great tips for home bakers. Now, if you want to skip the rigmarole, you can head over to my blog at moonandmagnolia.com where I have a recipe for a less sour sourdough bread. So if you don't feel like experimenting or you don't have time for trial and error, you can just head over and use that recipe for a less sour sourdough. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, if it's not sour, then why is it called sourdough? It's called sourdough not because of the flavor, but because it sours. So it's a process of souring. So when the bacteria and yeast digest the micronutrients on the grains, it's actually souring. But that does not indicate that it has to have a sour flavor. It just means that it has soured, or in other words, fermented. Now, even though I'm over here saying, well, it doesn't have to be sour, it's just called sourdough. Sourdough is often sour because that flavor does develop under certain conditions. And most of us are making sourdough bread under those particular conditions. Sourdough bread is a science. I'm gonna break this down as simply as possible and as least sciencey as possible because I'm a home baker, I am not a scientist. What you really need to know about changing the flavor of your sourdough bread is that we are balancing two things: lactic acid bacteria and acetic acid. I've shared a number of videos on YouTube about lacto-fermenting vegetables, but actually sourdough bread is lacto-fermentation. You are putting the grains under the conditions where lactic acid bacteria develops. Lactic acid bacteria is what suppresses a lot of gnarly organisms and bacteria that we don't want growing in our bread and in our dough. And it also has a less sour flavor. Lactic acid bacteria has a more mild yogurt-like flavor. Acetic acid is what makes sourdough taste sour. Acetic acid is the same acid that is found in vinegar. So it has a strong flavor. And though I'm not a scientist, if I'm wrong about this, leave a comment and let me know. But according to my understanding, acetic acid is actually less acidic than lactic acid, but it is more pungent. So even though it has less acid in it, it has a stronger flavor. So when we have more acetic acid in our sourdough, it tastes more sour. So in short, to create a less sour sourdough bread, we need to drop the levels of acetic acid and increase the lactic acid. When we are making sourdough bread, there is a very delicate balance between temperature and time. So let's talk about the temperature first. Acetic acid bacteria increases at high temperatures. So we want to decrease the temperature of our bulk fermentation. Not too cold, because too cold will slow things down so much that the lactic acid bacteria can't develop. So we want to keep it somewhere between 70 and 76 degrees. That can be a little tricky to maintain depending on your home or the season. The way I like to maintain the temperature of my bread is using a proofing box. I love my proofing box. I'll leave a link for that in the description box below if you want to check it out. But a proofing box allows you to set the exact temperature at which you bulk ferment your dough. It's tempting to put our dough in a warmer spot for fermentation because the warmer the place, the faster it ferments. But the warmer the spot, the more acetic acid will develop. So we do need to reduce the temperature of the bulk fermentation to encourage lactic acid bacteria and discourage acetic acid. Number 2. Cut back on the bulk fermentation time. And this is where things get a little bit complicated and maybe even contradictory to what I just said. So if you're bulk fermenting your dough at 70 to 76 degrees, that's on the cooler side for bulk fermentation, which means it will take longer to bulk ferment. If it takes too long, more acetic acid will develop. So we have to cut back on the temperature and the time to reduce the sourness. I've never really found time to be a helpful indicator if my dough is finished bulk fermenting, because every day is really different. Sometimes my ingredients are different, sometimes my starter is a little bit different. It can be hard to figure out the right temperature or to know what the temperature is in your home where you have your dough. So the easiest way to cut back on time is to actually look at the volume of your dough. If you are trying to reduce the sourness of your dough, bulk ferment it at 70 to 76 degrees and only allow it to get 1.5 to 2 times the size in volume. If it gets past 2 times volume, it's probably getting into the range where more acetic acid is developing. So rather than getting too wrapped up in setting a timer and making sure it bulk ferments for X amount of time, set it aside, check on it regularly, and notice, is it increasing in volume? And when it hits 1.5 to 2 times in size, it's time to move on to the next part of your recipe. Number 3. Reduce whole grain flour. Whole grain flours like whole wheat or rye are actually great for giving your starter and your dough a boost, and that's because they have a lot of micronutrients. However, those same micronutrients create more acetic acid. So one way to make your sourdough bread a little less sour is to reduce the whole grains in either your starter, your dough, or both. If you are the type of home baker who wants to experiment, this is a fun one to experiment with, because you can really start to hone in exactly how much whole grain flour creates the flavor that you like. You can try taking it all out. You can try reducing it by 50% or 25%. You can try not putting whole grains in your starter, but putting it in your dough, or vice versa. So this is a really great way to experiment without a lot of complications in your recipes. Number 4, use an active starter. So an active starter is less sour. Now, I will note that I published a video on YouTube recently about how you can bake with an active starter. I will leave a link for that in the description box below. It's a really helpful way to make bread if you're in a pinch. But if you do bake with starter that is past its peak, it will be more sour because more acetic acid has developed. One way to reduce the sourness of your sourdough bread is to make sure that you are using your starter either right when it has peaked, meaning it's bubbly, it's doubled in size and domed on top, or a little bit before. If it goes past the peak, it will be more sour. So along the lines with your starter, another way to reduce the sourness of your sourdough bread is to feed your starter more often. In time, a starter would usually get a little bit more sour. So if you happen to skip feeding sometimes, which I do kind of regularly, but if you happen to skip feeding sometimes, or if you're feeding it a lot of whole grains, it can get a little bit more sour. And also that's just sort of the natural progression of a sourdough starter. But if you feed your starter more regularly, every 12 to 24 hours if it's on the counter, or every week if you keep it in the fridge, you can reduce some of that acidity. And you can even feed it a little more regularly if you feel like it's a little too sour and you want to get rid of that sourness quickly. You can give it a few extra feedings for a couple of days, and that will help get rid of some of that sourness. A really great way to revitalize your starter, which will also reduce the sourness, is to use up almost all of it. Use it for discard recipes, bake something, whatever it is you do with your discard, and leave just a little bit and start building your starter back up again. That's a great thing to do for the health of your starter anyway. So whether or not you're trying to change the flavor of your sourdough bread, I would recommend doing that semi-regularly. 6, cut back on the cold proofing. This is where things get complicated again. And as I said, it's a delicate balance between temperature and time. So I know I said that cooler temperatures reduce the acetic acid, but I also said that longer duration increases the acetic acid. Cold proofing creates a more sour flavor in your bread because it slows the bulk fermentation down so that your dough doesn't overproof, but it increases the amount of time that it's fermenting. Usually, most of us are probably cold proofing our dough for about 12 plus hours, sometimes even a few days in the fridge. And it gets more sour because it is spending more time fermenting. So cold proofing will make your bread more sour. Now, if you want to cut back on the cold proofing to change the flavor, it will work. But it will also change the texture and the ability to score your bread too. So cold bread, when it goes into that hot Dutch oven when you bake it, releases steam. And that steam is what creates oven spring. Without the cold proofing, you're probably not going to get as much oven spring in your bread, and it's a little hard to score dough that isn't cold. So it will change the look of your bread and it will change the texture. However, it definitely makes a great loaf of bread. Also, if you decide to skip the cold proofing, you will need to change your process just a little bit for baking. So once your dough has bulk fermented, shape it, put it in a bowl or a Banneton basket, and let it rise for another hour or two before baking. But that's it. Number 7. Use more starter. The more starter you use, the faster your dough will bulk ferment. So it doesn't have to sit there for a really long time to bulk ferment. Now, if you're going to use more starter, I would not recommend dumping in like an extra 300 grams of starter, because that means you're going to have to change up your entire recipe. But you can add in a little bit more starter to speed up the process of your fermentation, and that can also help reduce the sourness of your sourdough bread. If you find that adding an extra starter makes your dough too sticky, just add in a little bit of extra flour. If you are experienced with baking sourdough, you can just pay attention to how the dough feels, and you can adjust the ingredients as needed. If you're not experienced with making sourdough, this is a great time to experiment to see what works and what doesn't. Don't be afraid to experiment with your dough, especially if you're new. It's the only way to learn. And last but not least in my list of how to make your sourdough bread less sour is to adjust the temperature of the water. I recommend using water that is about 80 degrees when you are baking your dough. That is warm enough to start the fermentation process and to encourage lactic acid bacteria growth, but not so warm that it encourages too much acetic acid. As I mentioned before, if you are trying to change the flavor of your sourdough, the first step is to look at your recipe. What in your recipe is not jiving with one of these tips? Does it have too much whole grain flour? Does it recommend bulk fermenting for too long? Does it suggest cold proofing for too long? So give yourself a few minutes to look at your recipe, look at the process, and figure out which pieces need a little bit of modification to create a different flavor in your sourdough bread. If you don't have a sourdough starter and you want to learn how to make sourdough bread, whether it's sour or not, head over to my website, moonandmagnolia.com, where you can download my free guide to making and using sourdough starter. It's a 30+ page ebook that'll teach you how to make a sourdough starter, how to make your first loaf of bread, sourdough discard recipes, troubleshooting, and more. It's a great place to start your sourdough journey. Also, over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com, I have a lot of recipes, tips, tricks for sourdough that can help you along the way for your sourdough journey. Be sure to sign up for my mailing list so that way you can get all of my blogs, recipes, and posts directly to your inbox. I'll leave a link for that in the description box below too. And again, I do want to note that this is not an exhaustive list of ways to create a different flavor for your sourdough. There are lots of other tips and tricks out there, but these I think are the easiest conditions to control. And with a little bit of experimenting, I think you will be on your way to making your best loaf of sourdough yet. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.